The wind here does not howl, it whispers, moving through the tall grass of the Auxois Plateau like a hand brushing away dust from an old painting. And if you stand very still on this ridge in eastern France, looking down at the sleepy valleys where the Ouse and Ozerain rivers carve their gentle paths, you can almost feel the ground, remembering the weight it once held. It is quiet now, a peaceful expanse of green fields and scattered trees under a sky that seems too vast to be filled by anything but clouds. Yet beneath this tranquil soil lies a layer of history so dense and tragic that it feels as though the earth itself is holding its breath. This is not merely a hill. It is a scar on the landscape of time, a place where the fate of the Western world pivoted on the edge of a gladius, leaving behind a silence that is heavy with the ghosts of 200,000 souls who screamed, fought, and starved in the mud. The modern town of Alesia sits here now, a quiet sentinel over the buried past. But if you close your eyes, the asphalt and the rooftops dissolve, the sounds of distant cars fade into the rhythmic thumping of pila against shields, and the air grows thick with the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Close your eyes and let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a warm cloak, anchoring you in this moment of safety while we prepare to walk backward into the storm. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let the present world slip away. Imagine the light changing, the harsh electric glow of the modern day softening into the flickering amber of campfires, and the pale, indifferent light of the moon reflecting off bronze helmets. We are drifting back to the year 52 BCE, a time when the map of Europe was not defined by clear borders and neatly drawn lines, but by the shifting loyalties of tribes and the relentless, creeping shadow of the Roman eagle. To understand the silence that lies over Alesia today, we must first understand the noise that preceded it, a cacophony of clashing cultures that had been building for generations. Gaul was not a country in the way we think of nations today. It was a vast, breathing mosaic of peoples, the Arverni, the Aedui, the Carnutes, the Mandubai, fiercely independent, culturally rich, and bound together by a shared Celtic heritage that prized individual glory over collective submission. It was a land of deep, ancient forests where druids gathered mistletoe with golden sickles, of fortified hilltop towns called Opida that rose like islands from the sea of trees, and of warriors who spiked their hair with lime and wore dorks of twisted gold around their necks as symbols of their divine connection to the gods. For centuries, these tribes had lived in a state of vibrant, chaotic equilibrium, fighting amongst themselves for cattle, land, and prestige. Their rivalries as old as the rivers that divided them. But to the south, the Roman Republic was hungry, its appetite for land and slaves growing with every passing year, and it viewed this untamed wilderness not as a neighbor, but as a problem to be solved and a treasury to be looted. Enter Julius Caesar, a man who walks into our story not as the marble statue we see in museums, cold and distant, but as a living, breathing human being in his late 40s, driven by a desperate, terrifying ambition. He was not yet the emperor of legend. He was a proconsul at the end of his term, deeply in debt, his political enemies in Rome sharpening their knives, waiting for him to fail. Caesar did not come to Gaul solely for the glory of Rome. He came because he needed a war to save himself, needing the plunder to pay his creditors, and the prestige to outshine his rivals, Pompey and Crassus. He was a wolf who had backed himself into a corner, and Gaul was the only escape. For 6 long years, he had marched his legions across this land, exploiting the ancient rivalries between the tribes, playing one chieftain against another, offering protection to some while annihilating others. His legions were a machine of terrifying efficiency, men who dug ditches as well as they swung swords, who could build a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days just to prove it could be done, and who followed Caesar with a devotion that bordered on religious worship. They were professional killers, hardened by years of campaigning. Their sandals worn thin by the miles they had marched in service of a man who promised them land and gold. By the beginning of 52 BCE, it seemed as though the conquest was complete. The tribes had been pacified, hostages had been taken, and Caesar had declared Gaul conquered, a feather in his cap to send back to the Senate. But peace imposed by the sword is fragile, brittle like dry wood waiting for a spark. The Gauls, proud and resentful, watched as their sacred groves were cut down, their grain seized to feed the legions, and their young men sold into slavery to adorn the villas of Italy. A low hum of rebellion began to vibrate through the Oppida. A whisper passed from trader to warrior, from druid to chieftain, that perhaps, if they could just set aside their ancient hatreds for a single season, they could drive the Romans back across the Alps. It was into this volatile atmosphere that a young nobleman of the Arvani tribe stepped forward, a man whose true name is lost to history, but whom we know by the title that became his legend, Vercingetorix. The name itself is a declaration, roughly translating to Victor of 100 battles, or King of great warriors, and he was the antithesis of the divided past. Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix was a king by birthright or a leader by sheer force of will in a time of crisis. But what matters is that he possessed a charisma that burned like a beacon in the gloom of the occupation. He was young, likely in his 20s, with a vision that extended beyond the borders of his own tribe. He saw that the Roman strength lay in their discipline and unity, and that the Gallic weakness was their division. To defeat the wolf, the pack had to become one. He called for a general council, engaging in secret meetings deep in the forests, where Roman spies could not hear, igniting the flames of resistance with speeches that spoke of liberty, of the shame of servitude, and of a Gaul that belonged to the Gauls. The spark finally caught in the winter of 52 BCE when the Carnutes massacred Roman merchants in the town of Cenabum, signaling to all the tribes that the truce was over. Vercingetorix seized the moment, raising an army not of mercenaries, but of patriots, disciplining them with a severity that matched Rome's own, cutting off the ears or gouging out the eyes of those who deserted, to show that this was a war for survival, not sport. The news of the uprising reached Caesar in Italy, and the speed with which he reacted would become legendary. He crossed the Alps in deep winter, shoveling snow aside to forge a path where none existed, appearing in Gaul like a phantom to rally his scattered legions. The stage was set, not for a simple skirmish, but for a collision of civilizations. On one side, the unstoppable momentum of the Roman military machine, led by a genius fighting for his political life. On the other, the desperate, furious passion of a united people fighting for their existence. led by a king who understood that he could not beat Rome by playing by Rome's rules. As the spring rains began to wash the snow from the valleys, the chessboard was being arranged for a game of cat and mouse that would burn cities to the ground and eventually lead them both to the sloping hills of the Mandobi territory. We stand now at the precipice of this conflict, looking out over the peaceful fields of the Auxois Plateau, imagining the silence before the thunder. The air is cool, the wind is gentle, and the world feels steady. But beneath our feet, the ghosts are beginning to stir, waiting to tell us how a king was broken and how an empire was forged in the mud. To understand the magnitude of the silence that eventually fell over Alesia, we must first let our minds drift backward, past the smoke of the burning cities and the rigid lines of Roman marching camps, to see Gaul as it was before it was broken. A world that was vibrant, loud, and tragically beautiful in its fragmentation. Imagine a tapestry woven from 1,000 different threads, each brilliant in color but pulling in a different direction. And you begin to see the landscape of this lost civilization. It is a mistake to think of pre-Roman Gaul as a dark wilderness inhabited by primitive savages huddled in mud huts. Instead, picture a land of thriving industry and complex social webs, where the smoke rising above the treetops came not from destruction, but from the forges of master craftsmen who were shaping iron and gold with a skill that rivaled anything found in the Mediterranean. The Gauls were artists of metal and war, creators of the Latin culture, whose swirling organic designs decorated their shields, their mirrors, and the heavy gold torques that rested against the throats of their nobility. If you were to walk through the gates of a major oppidum like Bibracte or Gergovia in the years before Caesar, you would be met with the sounds of a bustling, sophisticated society. The rhythmic clinking of hammers beating out bronze, the shouting of merchants trading Baltic amber and Italian wine, and the lowing of vast herds of cattle that were the measure of a man's wealth. The streets were paved with wood or stone, the houses were timber-framed and sturdy, and the people themselves were striking to the Roman eye, tall, wearing trousers and cloaks dyed in bright, checkered patterns that would one day evolve into the tartans of the north, their hair often bleached with lime water until it stood like a stiff pale mane around their heads. But this beauty concealed a fatal fracture, a hairline crack running through the bedrock of their culture that would ultimately bring the entire edifice crashing down. Gaul was not a nation. It was a collection of over 60 distinct tribes, each a sovereign state with its own laws, its own coins, and its own fierce pride. There were the Aedui in the center, wealthy and diplomatic, who styled themselves as the Brothers of Rome and traded heavily with the Republic. The Arverni in the highlands of the Massif Central, warlike and proud, who claimed hegemony over their neighbors. The maritime Veneti in the west, with their great oak ships that rode the Atlantic swells, and the Belgi in the north, fierce and distant, whom even the other Gauls regarded with a mix of fear and respect. These tribes were locked in a perpetual dance of rivalry and alliance, a fluid game of power where a friend in the spring could be an enemy by the harvest. They fought not for extermination, but for tribute and glory, small-scale wars that served as a release valve for the aggression of their warrior aristocracies. It was a system that had worked for centuries, keeping a balance of power where no single tribe could dominate the whole. But it was a system designed for an internal world, completely unprepared for the external sledgehammer that was about to swing from the south. Presiding over this chaotic mosaic were the Druids, the enigmatic intellectual caste who served as judges, priests, and keepers of memory. They gathered in the deep, sacred forests of the Carnutes, the spiritual center of Gaul, to settle disputes and uphold the oral laws that bound the tribes together culturally, if not politically. Historians still argue whether the Druids acted as a supranational force trying to unify Gaul politically, or if they were strictly religious figures who stayed out of the squabbles of kings. But it is known that their power was vast, capable of stopping armies in their tracks with a single word. Yet even their spiritual authority could not stitch together the political rifts that divided the people. The tragedy of Gaul was that it was a giant who did not know his own strength, a collection of powerful limbs that refused to obey a single head. This disunity was not just a diplomatic inconvenience, it was the very air they breathed. In every tribe, there were factions, the common people, often burdened by debt and looking for a protector, the Druids, guarding the soul of the culture, and the Equites, the warrior knights, who constantly vied for supremacy. It was a volatile, high-stakes environment where a leader could rise to power one day and be executed by his jealous peers the next. This is where the personal shadow of Vercingetorix begins to take shape. Long before he put on the helmet of war, he was born into the aristocracy of the Arverni, the son of Celtillus, a man who had once held the premier position in all of Gaul. But the story of the father is a dark omen for the son. Celtillus had tried to turn his influence into a formal kingship, a move that terrified the other nobles who cherished their oligarchic freedom. For his ambition, Celtillus was put to death by his own people, perhaps even by his own brother, Gobanitio. Imagine the young Vercingetorix growing up in the shadow of that execution, learning the hard lesson that in Gaul, ambition was a double-edged sword that could cut the hand that wielded it. He walked the line between the ancient traditions of his people and the terrifying new reality that was dawning on the horizon. He saw the Roman traders infiltrating the markets, their eyes assessing the richness of the land, their notebooks recording the animosities between the tribes. He saw the Aedui foolishly believing that their alliance with Rome would protect them, inviting the wolf into the sheepfold to settle their disputes with the Arverni and the Sequani. It was a time of slow, creeping dread, a sunset that lasted for years. The Gauls were wealthy, populous, and brave, but they were playing a game of checkers while the Romans were playing chess. They viewed war as a series of heroic duels, a chance to display personal valor and gain status. Rome viewed war as an industrial process, a means to an end where the only metric that mattered was total submission. As we drift through this pre-war landscape, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke, we can feel the tragedy of the missed opportunities. If the Aedui and the Arverni had stood back to back, if the councils had listened to the Druids' warnings, if the tribes had seen the legions not as mercenaries to be hired, but as a deluge to be damned, history might have flowed down a different riverbed. But the rivalries were too deep, the grudges too old. The Arverni hated the Aedui more than they feared the Romans. And in that hatred, Caesar found the crack he needed to pry the entire country apart. The golden fields were ripe, the mines were deep, and the people were divided. To the south, the man with the receding hairline and the eyes of a shark was finishing his term in Spain, looking at his mounting debts and turning his gaze toward the Alps. The mosaic was beautiful, intricate, and shimmering in the sun, but it was made of glass, and the hammer was already falling. The peace of the villages, with their thatched roofs and muddy streets, was a fragile illusion, a lullaby sung before the nightmare began. We leave the vibrant, chaotic world of free Gaul here, suspended in its last moments of independence, to turn our eyes to the agent of its destruction, a man who brought with him not just a sword, but a ledger, and who was prepared to spend Gallic lives like copper coins to buy his own immortality. Now the camera of our mind drifts south, over the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, and down into the dusty, ordered grid of a Roman camp, where the air smells entirely different, not of wild pine and damp earth, but of oiled leather, sharp vinegar, and the metallic tang of polished iron. Here, inside a tent illuminated by the steady glow of an oil lamp, sits the architect of the coming storm, a man whose name echoes through history like a thunderclap, but who, in this moment, is merely a politician balancing on a razor's edge. Julius Caesar is 42 years old, his hairline receding, his eyes dark and restless, a man possessed by a terrifying energy that seems to vibrate in the stillness of the night. To understand why Alesia happened, why the starvation and the slaughter were deemed necessary, we must strip away the marble myths and see Caesar for what he truly was, a man drowning in debt. He had borrowed colossal sums of money to bribe his way through the cutthroat elections of Rome, financing public games, gladiatorial shows, and grand gestures to win the love of the mob. Now he was proconsul, a governor with legal immunity, but he knew that the moment he stepped down without a triumph, without a mountain of gold to pay back his creditors, he would be ruined, prosecuted by his enemies, and cast into exile. The conquest of Gaul was not born from a grand strategic desire to protect Italy. It was a personal financial necessity, a looting expedition disguised as a defensive war. He looked north and saw not nations or cultures, but a reservoir of raw capital, slaves to be sold, mines to be tapped, and glory to be harvested to eclipse his rivals, Pompey the Great and Crassus. Pompey had conquered the East. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome. Caesar had only his name and his ambition, and he was hungry. He arrived in the province of Transalpine Gaul, the southern strip of France that Rome already controlled, like a wolf that had not eaten in weeks, scanning the horizon for a pretext, any excuse to march his legions north into the free lands. The instrument he brought with him was the Roman legion, and it is impossible to overstate the shock this machine inflicted upon the warrior culture of the Gauls. The Gallic way of war was individualistic, heroic, and noisy, a chaotic rush of champions seeking personal glory. The Roman way was a terrifying silence, followed by a synchronized explosion of violence. A Roman legion was an organism of 5,000 men who moved as one, a meat grinder of discipline where individuality was suppressed in favor of the unit. They wore uniform armor of mail strips, carried the tall, curved scutum shield that covered them from chin to shin, and wielded the gladius, a short stabbing sword designed not to slash, but to puncture vital organs with surgical efficiency. But their most dangerous weapon was not the sword. It was the spade. Caesar's men were soldier engineers who could march 20 miles in a day with 60 pounds of gear, and then, before resting, dig a fortified camp with walls, ditches, and watchtowers in a matter of hours. They reshaped the geography to suit their needs, bridging wide rivers like the Rhine just to show they could, then dismantling the bridge to show they didn't need it. This was a form of warfare the Gauls could scarcely comprehend, a war against time and earth as much as against men. When the Helvetii tribe, a massive migration of 300,000 men, women, and children, tried to move across the borders in search of new lands, Caesar found his excuse. He painted them as a threat to Rome, refused them passage, and then hunted them down with a ruthlessness that set the tone for the next 8 years. He did not just defeat their warriors, he sent the survivors back to their burned-out homes to serve as a buffer state, a cold calculation of demographics. This was the wolf in his element, moving with a speed, celeritas, that left his enemies paralyzed, appearing where he was least expected, marching through winter storms, always attacking, always pressing. Yet for all his brutality, Caesar was a man of immense charm and intellect, a complex figure who could weep over the tragedies of history while orchestrating them. He fought with a sword in one hand and a pen in the other, dictating his famous commentaries on the Gallic War to his scribes, even as the battles raged. These were not just reports. They were propaganda, dispatched to Rome to be read aloud in the Forum, crafting a narrative where he was the hero of civilization, holding back the barbaric tide. He wrote of the Gauls with a mix of admiration for their bravery and disdain for their fickleness, carefully constructing a justification for every village burned and every treaty broken. Historians still argue whether Caesar planned the total conquest of Gaul from the very beginning, or if he was simply an opportunistic gambler who kept doubling down on his bets as the frontier expanded. The evidence suggests the latter. He was a man surfing a wave of violence, reacting to uprisings, punishing dissent, and pushing the boundaries of the empire further north with every season, driven by the insatiable need for more plunder to feed the maw of Roman politics. By the time he reached the English Channel, he had become the wealthiest man in the world, his debts paid in Gallic gold and Gallic blood. But the deeper he pushed, the more the resentment grew in the shadows of the forests. The Gauls were learning. They watched the legions march. They studied the Roman formations, and they began to understand that their old ways of fighting were obsolete. They saw that Caesar was not a god, but a man who was overextended, whose supply lines were thin, and whose arrogance was growing. The wolf had eaten well, but he had wandered deep into the woods, far from the safety of his den. As the years of the campaign ground on, 58, 57, 56 BCE, the atmosphere in Gaul changed from shock to a simmering, quiet rage. The Roman traders who followed the army, setting up shop in the wake of the slaughter to buy slaves and sell wine, began to disappear on lonely roads. The tribute payments arrived late. The hostages taken by Caesar to ensure the loyalty of the tribes whispered to each other in the camps. The illusion of pacification was holding, but only just. Caesar, confident in his genius, believed he had broken the spirit of the people, that the war was effectively over, and only police actions remained. He spent his winters in northern Italy, playing the politician, leaving his legions quartered in Gaul to keep the peace. But he had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit and the deep ancestral bond the Gauls had with their land. He did not see the fire that was kindling in the heart of the Arverni, nor did he hear the name that was beginning to be spoken with reverence in the secret councils of the chiefs. He was looking at his ledger, counting his victories, unaware that the true war had not yet even begun. The debt he had incurred in Rome was paid, but a new debt was accumulating in the soil of Gaul, a debt of vengeance that would demand a terrible price. The wolf was about to find that the forest had teeth of its own. As we leave the orderly, lamplit tent of the proconsul and drift back out into the wild, dark expanse of the countryside, the wind picks up, carrying with it the smell of smoke and the faint, rhythmic beating of a sword against a shield, a signal that the time for submission is over, and the time for the fire has come. The change did not come with a shout, but with a smell, a thick, acrid scent that drifted on the wind, coating the back of the throat with the taste of soot and lost labor. It was the smell of a country burning itself alive to save its soul. Until this moment, the war had been a series of violent collisions, armies crashing into each other like waves against a cliff. But Vercingetorix had realized something that no Gallic leader before him had grasped. The Roman wolf was a beast of immense power, but it had a hollow belly. He understood that Caesar's legions were an unstoppable machine only as long as they were fed, that the heavy infantry, for all their discipline and iron, could not fight the air, nor could they march on empty stomachs. And so, in the early months of 52 BCE, the king of the Arverni made a decision that sent a shudder through the spine of Gaul, a command so ruthless and desperate that it marked the end of the old world and the beginning of the nightmare. He ordered the scorched earth. It was a strategy of horrific simplicity. If the Romans needed grain, the Gauls would burn the fields. If they needed shelter, the Gauls would burn the villages. If they needed water, the Gauls would poison the wells or divert the streams. The horizon, once dotted with the peaceful smoke of hearth fires, became a continuous jagged line of orange flame and black smoke, a curtain of destruction drawn across the land to blind and starve the invader. Imagine the scene in the council tents when Vercingetorix laid out this plan to the assembled chieftains. These were men whose entire status, whose very identity, was tied to the land they owned and the protection they offered their people. To tell them that they must torch their own granaries, slaughter the cattle they could not drive away, and burn the roof beams of the houses their grandfathers had built was to ask them to commit cultural suicide. Yet Vercingetorix stood before them, his presence commanding, his voice cutting through their murmurs of dissent like a cold wind. He argued that liberty required a price, that it was better to reign over a desert than to slave in a paradise owned by Rome. He told them that every bushel of wheat left behind was a weapon placed in Caesar's hand, every standing barn a fortress for the enemy. Reluctantly, with heavy hearts and eyes wet with the tears of a pride swallowed, the chiefs agreed. The orders went out, and the fires began. From the territory of the Bituriges to the lands of the Aedui, the countryside transformed. The legions, marching out from their winter quarters, expecting to forage, as they always had, found themselves walking into a wasteland. The patrols sent out to gather corn found only ash. The scouting parties, looking for hay for the horses, found only scorched earth. The lush green Gaul that Caesar had exploited for years was vanishing, replaced by a grey, silent landscape where the only thing that grew was hunger. For the Roman soldier, this was a terrifying new reality. Used to the abundance of the plunder, They were now rationed to the brink of starvation. The daily allowance of grain, the lifeblood of the legion, began to dwindle. Men who were accustomed to marching 20 miles a day with full kit began to stumble, their eyes sinking into their sockets, their belts tightened to the last notch. The mighty machine of the legion, so precise and terrifying in battle, began to creak and groan under the weight of deprivation. Caesar himself felt the pressure, his dispatches to Rome becoming more urgent, his movements more erratic as he chased rumors of food like a desperate animal. He was no longer the hunter. He was the one being herded, steered by the fires into the places Vercingetorix wanted him to go. And all the while, the Gallic cavalry, superior in horsemanship and moving through their own country, hovered on the flanks of the Roman columns like ghosts. They did not engage the infantry, Vercingetorix had forbidden it, but they struck the foragers, the water carriers, the stragglers. Any Roman who strayed too far from the safety of the square to find a handful of roots or a stray goat was cut down. His body left as a grim warning in the mud. It was a war of nerves, a psychological siege where the walls were the horizon itself. However, this strategy of total devastation had a breaking point, a limit where the human heart could no longer endure the logic of war. It came at the city of Avaricum, the capital of the Bituriges, a place of such beauty and wealth that its people begged Vercingetorix to spare it. They argued that its walls were strong, that it was surrounded by marshes and could be defended, that it was the fairest city in all of Gaul, and its destruction would break the spirit of the resistance. Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix yielded to the pleading of the Bituriges to spare their city out of mercy or political weakness, a decision that would ultimately cost him dearly. He relented, allowing the city to stand, and in doing so, he gave Caesar exactly what he needed, a target. The Romans, starving and desperate, threw themselves at Avaricum with a ferocity born of hunger. They built a massive siege ramp in 25 days, enduring cold and rain, driven by the knowledge that the city held the grain they needed to survive. When Avaricum finally fell, the result was not a conquest, it was a massacre. Of the 40,000 inhabitants, men, women, and children, scarcely 800 escaped. The Romans, maddened by the weeks of deprivation, spared no one. They slaughtered the population in the streets, in the temples, in their homes, sorting their hunger for food and their thirst for blood in an orgy of violence that shocked even the hardened centurions. The fall of Avaricum was a tragedy, but for Vercingetorix, it served a grim purpose. It proved him right. In the ashes of the fairest city, the surviving Gauls saw the truth of his words. There could be no half measures, no sanctuaries, no mercy. The disaster solidified his command. The tribes, horrified by the slaughter, rallied even closer to him, realizing that their only hope lay in total obedience to his scorched earth doctrine. The war entered a darker, more desperate phase. Caesar had his grain now, but he had paid for it with time and momentum. The spring was turning into summer, and the great decisive battle he sought, the one where he could crush the rebellion in a single stroke, remained elusive. Vercingetorix continued to withdraw, pulling the Romans deeper into the interior, refusing to give battle, burning the bridges behind him. He was luring the wolf towards the high ground, towards the territory of the Mandubi, towards a specific hill where he believed he could finally stop the retreat and stand his ground. The smoke of the burning villages drifted continuously across the sun, casting a perpetual twilight over the land, a visual reminder that the world was ending. The legions marched on, their bellies full for the moment, but their spirits uneasy, walking through a silent, empty land that watched them with 1,000 unseen eyes. The game of cat and mouse was nearing its end. Vercingetorix was running out of space to retreat, and Caesar was running out of patience. The road was leading them both to a place where the burning would stop and the digging would begin. A place where the destiny of two civilizations would be decided not by movement, but by a terrible, suffocating stillness. The hill of Alesia was waiting, rising from the valley floor like an altar prepared for a sacrifice. The road to the end did not look like a path to a graveyard. At first, it looked like salvation. After weeks of shadowing the legions, of skirmishes in the tall grass, and the relentless stress of the scorched earth retreat, the sight of the Mandubi territory rising in the distance must have felt like a promise of rest. The turning point had come suddenly, in a burst of chaotic violence on the open plains just days before. Vercingetorix, perhaps overconfident after the success of his guerrilla tactics, or pressured by his impatient cavalry commanders, who chafed at the constant retreating, had authorized a direct attack on the Roman column. It was a gamble, a break from the discipline that had served him so well, and it failed catastrophically. The German cavalry, mercenaries hired by Caesar, wild, hulking men on heavy horses, had smashed into the Gallic lines, shattering their formation and sending the flower of the Gallic nobility fleeing in disarray. Stung, bloodied, and realizing the vulnerability of his army on the open ground, Vercingetorix made the fateful decision that would echo through the centuries. He turned his army away from the open plains and marched them toward the refuge of the oppidum of Alesia. It was a decision born of logic. Alesia was a fortress of nature, a place where armies had shattered themselves before. But in the grand calculus of war, it was the moment the mouse ran into the bottle and waited for the cork to be placed. Alesia was not merely a town, it was a geological throne, situated on the summit of Mont Auxois, a plateau shaped like a giant lozenge. It rose 150 meters above the surrounding valley floor, its limestone cliffs sheer and forbidding. To the north and south, it was washed by the waters of the Ouse and Osirene rivers, natural moats that glinted in the summer sun. And to the east, a broad plain stretched out, the only obvious approach, but one easily defended. It looked impregnable, a sanctuary where the 80,000 infantry of the Gallic coalition could rest, regroup, and dare the Romans to attack them uphill. As the vast column of warriors, horses, and baggage trains wound its way up the slopes and squeezed through the gates of the town, a wave of relief must have washed over them. Here, they were above the world. They could look down and see the enemy coming, rain spears and rocks upon them, and hold out until the winter snows forced the Romans to withdraw. The walls of the town were strengthened with a murus gallicus, a clever grid of timber beams and stone rubble designed to absorb the shock of battering rams. Inside, there were supplies, water, and the comforting presence of the Mandubi people who welcomed their defenders. For a brief, shining moment, Alesia felt like a victory. The high ground belonged to Gaul. But as the dust of their arrival settled and the sun began to dip toward the western hills, the illusion of safety began to fracture. Vercingetorix, standing at the ramparts, watching the horizon, would have seen the ominous cloud of dust that heralded the arrival of the nemesis. Caesar was not retreating, he was following. And as the Roman army poured into the valley below, they did not form up for a suicidal charge up the slopes as the Gauls might have hoped. They did not shout or bang their shields. They stopped. They flowed around the base of the hill like a rising grey tide, systematically taking positions on the surrounding heights, measuring, pointing, and staking out the ground. The Romans were not preparing to fight. They were preparing to work. It was in this silence, watching the tiny figures of the legionaries moving with the coordinated purpose of ants, that the cold realization must have struck the Gallic command. They were not in a fortress. They were in a trap. By fixing his army in one place, Vercingetorix had surrendered his greatest advantage, mobility. He had gathered the heart of the resistance into a single container, and Caesar, the master of logistics and engineering, was about to seal the lid. The geography that made Alesia strong for defense made it fatal for escape. The plateau was large, but it was finite. 80,000 soldiers, along with thousands of cavalry horses and the civilian population of the town, were now crowded onto this hilltop. The logistics were immediately terrifying. The wells of Alesia were deep, but were they deep enough for 100,000 throats? The granaries were full, but for how long could they feed a city that had suddenly tripled in population? Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix intended Alesia to be a staging ground for a counterattack, or if he was simply backed into a corner by the failed cavalry engagement. But the result was the same. He was pinned. Below him, the Roman army, fewer in number, perhaps 50,000 men, began to unroll a carpet of terror across the valley floor. The sounds of the pickaxe and the shovel replaced the sounds of battle. The Romans were digging. They were not building a camp. They were building a cage. From the heights, the Gauls watched with a mixture of mockery and growing dread as the first lines of the Roman circumvallation began to take shape. At first, it might have seemed absurd. How could 50,000 men hope to encircle a hill that was miles in circumference? But the Roman work rate was relentless, a display of industrial warfare that had no parallel in the ancient world. Trees were felled by the thousands, the forests around the valley stripped bare to provide timber for the palisades. Earth was moved by the ton, reshaping the valley floor into a geometric nightmare of ditches and ramparts. The Gauls launched sorties, their cavalry thundering down the slopes to harass the workers, to disrupt the digging, to break the tightening noose. There were desperate, bloody clashes in the mud, horses screaming, swords clashing against shovels. But the legions simply dropped their tools, formed a shield wall, repelled the attack, and then, terrifyingly, picked up their tools and resumed digging. The work did not stop for death. It did not stop for night. The ring of firelight around the base of the hill grew brighter each evening, a necklace of flames that was slowly strangling the hope of the Arvernian king. Inside the walls, the atmosphere shifted from relief to a claustrophobic tension. The air grew thick with the smell of too many men and animals confined in too small a space. The joyous shouts of the arrival were replaced by the low murmurs of rationing and the nervous stamping of horses that had no room to gallop. Vercingetorix, the visionary who had united the tribes, now faced a challenge that no speech could solve. He was no longer fighting a war of movement. He was fighting a war of time. He knew that he could not stay here forever. He had to break the siege before it was fully formed, or he had to summon help from the outside in a desperate bid to save his cavalry, the elite of the Gallic nobility, who were useless in a siege and eating precious grain. He ordered them to break out by night, to slip through the unfinished sections of the Roman lines and ride to the four corners of Gaul. Their mission was simple and desperate: summon the relief army. Tell the tribes that their king is trapped. Tell them that if Alesia falls, Gaul falls. Watch them go, shadows slipping into the darkness, the last link to the outside world, leaving the infantry behind to wait. As the sound of their hooves faded into the distance, the silence returned, heavier than before. The hilltop had become a waiting room, and the only thing growing in the valley below was the wall that would separate the living from the dead. The trap was set, the door was closed, and the key was in Caesar's pocket. The sun rose over the Ozarene Valley, not to the crow of a rooster, but to the rhythmic, grinding percussion of iron biting into clay. If you had been standing on the ramparts of Alesia in those first few days of the siege, looking down from your high perch, you would have witnessed a spectacle that defied the natural order of the world. Armies were supposed to clash, to bleed, to scream, and then to rest. They were not supposed to turn the landscape itself into a weapon, but below, the Roman legionaries had set aside their shields and taken up the dolabra, the heavy pickaxe that was as much a part of their kit as their sword. They were stripping the skin off the earth. Caesar had realized quickly that storming the heights of Alesia would be suicide. The slopes were too steep, the defenders too numerous. He would not send his men up the hill to die. Instead, he would bring the hill to its knees by simply ensuring that nothing, not a single grain of wheat or a drop of water, ever went up there again. He ordered the construction of a line of circumvallation, a massive fortification encircling the entire plateau. But to call it a wall is to understate its menace. It was a wooden noose, 11 miles in circumference, being tightened by 50,000 pairs of hands. The work began with a deceptive simplicity. At the foot of the hill, seemingly too close to the enemy lines, the Romans dug a trench. It was not a shallow ditch for cover. It was a scar in the earth, 20 feet wide with sheer vertical sides, designed so that anyone who fell in could not easily climb out. This was the first line of terror, a psychological barrier as much as a physical one, meant to halt the sudden rushes of the Gallic infantry, while the real work took place behind it. And it was behind this initial scar that the true genius of Roman engineering began to rise. 400 yards back, safely out of range of the Gallic missiles, the main fortifications were taking shape. The soldiers dug 2 parallel trenches, each 15 feet wide and deep. The earth from these ditches was not discarded. It was piled high to form a rampart, a man-made ridge that stretched as far as the eye could see. To stand in the bottom of one of those ditches was to be swallowed by the earth, looking up at a wall of clay that blocked out the sky. But earth alone was not enough for Caesar. He needed water. In a feat of hydraulic engineering that seems impossible for an army on the march, he diverted the flow of the local rivers, channeling the water into the inner trench until it became a stagnant, muddy moat. Imagine the morale of the Gauls watching this from above, seeing the rivers they had known all their lives, the streams where they had watered their horses, suddenly bending to the will of the invader, flowing where the Romans told them to flow. It was a demonstration of power that went beyond the military. It was a claim of dominion over nature itself. Behind the water and the clay, the rampart was crowned with a palisade of sturdy timber, a 12-foot-high fence of sharpened stakes that bristled like the spine of a dragon, and every 80 feet, a distance carefully calculated to ensure that every inch of the wall could be covered by archers, a wooden tower rose into the air. Day by day, the towers multiplied, standing like silent sentinels, their upper stories filled with scorpions and ballistae, the terrifying Roman artillery that could punch a bolt through a man's chest from 300 yards away. For the Roman soldier, this was a labor of exhaustion. They worked in shifts, digging in the heavy clay soil, felling trees in the nearby forests, hauling timber, and weaving willow branches into hurdles to hold the earth in place. They worked with their armor nearby, their helmets often hanging from a shovel handle, eyes constantly scanning the slopes for the inevitable sortie. When the Gauls did attack, pouring down the hill in desperate attempts to burn the works or kill the workers, the shovel was dropped, the pilum was seized, and the engineer became the legionary instantly. The discipline required to switch between heavy manual labor and life-or-death combat again and again is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. It was a grueling, sweaty, back-breaking existence fueled by vinegar water and hard grain, driven by the relentless barking of the centurions and the knowledge that their general was watching. Caesar was everywhere, riding the lines on his horse, encouraging the men, adjusting the plans, his red cloak a visible promise that he was sharing their dust and their danger. From the Gallic perspective, the view was one of slow, creeping horror. At first, the wall was just a line in the dirt. Then it was a mound. Then it was a barrier. Finally, it was a prison. The sheer scale of the construction was demoralizing. The Gauls were warriors who prized the sudden, overwhelming charge, the clash of champions. They had no concept of this kind of warfare, this relentless, ant-like industry that never slept. They saw the forests receding as the Romans consumed the wood. They saw the valley floor transforming into a geometric grid of death. Vercingetorix must have looked down at the ring closing around him and realized that he was fighting a new kind of enemy, one that did not need to cross swords to kill him. The wall was not just keeping the Romans out, it was locking the Gauls in. And as the circle closed, the reality of the siege set in. The vast herds of cattle they had brought with them were already being slaughtered for food. The grain was being rationed. The noise of the construction below, the thud of axes, the shouting of orders, the crash of timber, became the soundtrack to their starvation. Yet even as the first ring, the circumvallation, neared completion, sealing Alesia from the world, Caesar knew it was not enough. He was a student of history. He knew that Vercingetorix's cavalry had escaped before the trap snapped shut. He knew that out there, in the vast forests of Free Gaul, a relief army was gathering. A massive storm was brewing on the horizon, a coalition of tribes that would dwarf his own army in numbers. If they arrived while he was besieging Alesia, he would be the meat in the sandwich, trapped between the anvil of the town and the hammer of the relief force. Most generals would have retreated. Most would have looked at the numbers, 80,000 inside, perhaps 250,000 outside, against his 50,000, and concluded that the position was untenable. But Caesar did not retreat. Instead, he gave an order that remains one of the most audacious in military history. He ordered his men to turn around. They would not just build a wall facing the city, they would build a second wall facing the world. They would build a line of contravallation, an outer ring to protect themselves from the relief army. They were going to besiege the besiegers. The implications of this decision were terrifying. The Romans were voluntarily locking themselves into a donut-shaped strip of land, a thin corridor between two hostile fires. They would be cut off from their own supply lines, forced to survive on what they had stockpiled. They were building their own prison to destroy their enemy. As the soldiers wiped the sweat from their brows and turned their spades to the outer perimeter, breaking the ground for a second 11-mile circuit, the stakes of the gamble became clear. There was no way out. If the walls failed, they would be annihilated. If the food ran out, they would starve. Caesar was betting everything, his life, his army, his reputation, and the fate of Rome, on the strength of these walls and the sweat of his men. The wooden serpent was growing a second head, and in the space between its coils, the legions prepared to endure the unendurable. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of digging, a sound that had become more terrifying than any war cry, for it was the sound of destiny being carved into the indifferent earth. If the double ring of walls was the skeleton of Caesar's trap, the features he added next were the venom. As the summer heat intensified and the dust rose in choking clouds from the valley floor, Caesar looked at his fortifications and realized they were still not enough. He knew that when the relief army arrived, his men would be stretched thin, forced to defend a perimeter of nearly 14 miles on the outside and 10 miles on the inside. He could not be everywhere at once. He needed the ground itself to fight for him, to slow the enemy down, to bleed them before they ever reached the ramparts. And so he unleashed the dark creativity of the Roman military mind, transforming the grassy fields in front of his walls into a nightmare of hidden death. He called for the creation of a zone of fear, a landscape so treacherous that no man could run across it without paying a terrible price. The soldiers laid down their spades and picked up their whittling knives. They began to craft a series of booby traps that remain, to this day, a testament to the terrifying ingenuity of ancient warfare. The first line of defense, closest to the Roman trenches, was a thicket of brutality the soldiers called chippy. They took massive tree trunks, sharpened the ends of their sturdy branches into points, and buried them deep in trenches so that only the jagged interlocking tips protruded from the ground. They were lashed together, row upon row, 5 deep. A warrior charging into this barrier would find himself impaled, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in a cage of dead wood, while Roman javelins rained down on him. It was a wall without a wall, a hedge of thorns made of oak and gravity. But Caesar did not stop there. In front of the Kippy, he ordered the digging of 8 rows of conical pits, each 3 feet deep. At the bottom of each pit, a thigh-thick stake was driven into the earth, its tip fire-hardened and sharpened to a needlepoint. The stake rose only a few inches from the bottom, invisible from the surface. The soldiers then packed the earth around the base to make it solid, and covered the mouth of the pit with twigs and brush, hiding the danger completely. They gave these traps a name that was a grim, dark joke, a bit of gallows humor that has survived the centuries. They called them lilia, lilies, because the funnel shape of the pit resembled the delicate flower. But the fruit of this flower was a stake through the foot or the groin. A warrior stepping on a lily would be crippled instantly, the weight of his own body driving the wood through bone and sinew, leaving him screaming in the no man's land, a living obstacle to the men behind him. Still, Caesar was not satisfied. In the grass ahead of the pits, he scattered the stimuli, spurs. These were iron barbs, essentially heavy fishhooks, embedded in blocks of wood and buried entirely underground, with only the curved iron point hidden in the tufts of grass. They were invisible to a running man. They were designed to snag the soft leather of a Gallic shoe or pierce a bare foot, tearing flesh and tendons with every step. The psychological impact of these defenses was calculated and profound. The Gauls were warriors of the charge. Their entire martial philosophy was built on the terrifying momentum of the initial rush, the furor gallicus that could shatter enemy lines through sheer impact. But how do you charge when every step might be your last? How do you run when the ground is eating you? Caesar had stripped them of their speed. He forced them to look down at their feet instead of up at the enemy, turning a sprint into a hesitant, stumbling crawl. He had turned the battlefield into a minefield, 2,000 years before the concept existed. Inside the Roman camp, the mood was one of grim satisfaction, mixed with anxiety. The legionaries knew that these traps were their insurance policy. They spent their days sharpening stakes, testing the points with their thumbs, and planting them like farmers sowing a harvest of pain. They knew that they were fewer in number than the horde gathering in the forests, and these wooden sentinels were the only thing that might even the odds. Caesar writes of these preparations with a cold, clinical detachment in his commentaries, describing the dimensions and the spacing as if he were an architect describing a villa. But for the men in the trenches, it was a labor of survival. They were turning the Auxois Valley into a machine, one where the gears were made of wood and iron, and the fuel was human life. From the heights of Alesia, the Gauls could see the activity, but they could not see the details. They saw the Romans working in the earth, burying things, smoothing the grass back over. The mystery must have been agonizing. Vercingetorix, looking down, would have recognized the trap for what it was, a denial of honest combat. It was a message that the Romans did not intend to fight fair. They intended to win. The architecture of cruelty was nearly complete. The inner ring squeezed the city, the outer ring faced the world, and in between lay the legions, sharpening their swords, checking their armor, and waiting. The sun beat down on the dried mud, baking the clay hard. The wind whistled through the sharpened branches of the sipi, making a sound like dry bones rattling. The stage was set. The traps were baited. And now the only thing left to do was to wait for the hunger inside the city to become louder than the fear of the traps outside. The silence of the engineering phase was ending. The screaming was about to begin. The walls of Alesia were built to keep the Romans out. But as the weeks dragged on, they became the jaws of a trap that was slowly chewing the life out of the defenders. Inside the oppidum, the initial adrenaline of the siege had evaporated, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness that settled in the belly and refused to leave. The grain was gone. The cattle had been eaten. The horses that were not essential for war were being looked at with hungry eyes. The 80,000 warriors, the flower of Gallic resistance, were reduced to ghost-like figures, conserving their energy, sitting in the shadows of the ramparts, while the summer sun beat down on a city that was slowly dying. But the tragedy of Alesia was not just military. It was a human catastrophe that would culminate in one of the most heart-wrenching episodes of antiquity. The city was not just a fortress, it was a home. The Mandubi tribe lived here. Their wives, their children, their elderly parents, thousands of non-combatants were trapped alongside the soldiers, and as the rations dwindled to nothing, the terrible logic of survival began to take hold. A council was called, a grim gathering of gaunt faces in the chieftain's hall. There were dark whispers, some even suggesting cannibalism, a desperate measure proposed by an Arvernian noble named Cretonatus to feed the warriors on the flesh of those too old to fight. Vercingetorix rejected this horror, but the alternative he chose was hardly less cruel. He decided that the useless mouths, the women, the children, the sick, and the elderly, must leave. It was a decision born of cold, mathematical necessity. Every mouthful of food eaten by a child was a mouthful denied to a spear thrower. If the army was to fight the coming battle, the civilians had to go. Imagine the scene at the gates of Alesia as the order was given. The crying of mothers, the confusion of the elderly, the heartbreaking goodbyes as husbands pushed their wives and daughters out of the safety of the walls, telling them that the Romans would surely take them in. It was a common practice in ancient warfare for besiegers to accept civilians as slaves. It was a grim fate, but it was better than starvation. The Mandubi, the very people who had opened their homes to Vercingetorix, were now being evicted from them. They walked out of the gates in a mournful procession, clutching their meager possessions, walking down the slope toward the Roman lines with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. They believed they were walking toward servitude, yes, but also toward bread. They reached the edge of the Roman fortifications, the line where the Chipi and the Lilia began, and they stopped. They called out to the sentries, begging to be taken, offering themselves up as slaves in exchange for a crust of food. But Caesar was watching. From his command post, he looked down at the huddle of thousands of refugees pressing against his defenses. He saw the women holding up starving infants. He heard the pleas for mercy, and he made a calculation that chills the blood. He knew that Vercingetorix was trying to offload the burden of feeding these people onto him. If Caesar took them in, he would have to feed them from his own dwindling supplies, or guard them, or transport them, all distractions from the siege. If he fed them, he weakened his own army. If he let them pass, he relieved the pressure on the enemy. So, he gave the order. No. The Roman shields locked together. The sentries did not open the gates. They stood silent, impassive, a wall of iron rejecting the wave of humanity. Caesar ordered them to be driven back. The civilians turned around, confused and terrified, and trudged back up the slope toward the walls of Alesia. But the gates of the city were closed. The Gallic warriors on the ramparts, their own husbands, fathers, and brothers, looked down with tears in their eyes, but they did not open the doors. Vercingetorix could not let them back in. The logic of the purge was absolute. If they returned, the army would starve and Gaul would fall, and so the Mandubii were trapped. They were caught in the no man's land, a narrow strip of bare earth between the Gallic walls and the Roman traps. They had nowhere to go. They sat down in the dust, huddled together for warmth as the night fell, believing that surely, by morning, one side would relent. Surely, the Romans would want the slaves. Surely, The Gauls would not let their own families die. But the sun rose, and the gates remained shut. The Romans remained still. The days began to pass. The crying of the children grew weaker, then stopped altogether. The pleading of the women turned into a low, continuous wailing that drifted up to the walls and down to the trenches, a sound that must have haunted the sleep of every man who heard it. They began to eat the grass, the roots, the leather of their sandals. They died slowly, in full view of two armies. Historians still argue whether this act was the ultimate stain on Caesar's legacy, a war crime of monstrous proportions even by Roman standards, or if the blame lies with Vercingetorix for expelling them into a trap he knew existed. But the moral debate meant nothing to the dying. They were pawns in a contest of wills, ground into the dust by the refusal of two leaders to blink. For the Roman soldiers, it was a test of discipline to watch women starve and do nothing. For the Gallic warriors, it was a torture of the soul. To see your wife dying 100 yards away and be forbidden to help her broke something inside them. It sapped their fury and replaced it with a hollow, crushing despair. The no man's land became a graveyard. The bodies piled up in the ditches, unburied, their skeletal forms a testament to the brutality of the stalemate. The stench of death wafted over both lines, a grim reminder of the stakes. Caesar writes of this briefly, almost dismissively, in his commentaries, focusing on the strategic necessity, but the silence of those thousands of dead mandubi screams louder than his words. It was the moment the war lost any pretense of glory. It was no longer about honor or courage. It was about who could endure the most horror. The starving civilians were the physical manifestation of the siege itself. The innocent crushed between the immovable object of Roman engineering and the irresistible force of Gallic resistance. Eventually, the wailing ceased. The silence that followed was heavy and accusing. The space between the walls was now a zone of the dead, a psychological scar that would never heal. Inside Alesia, the warriors tightened their belts and sharpened their swords with a new grim fatalism. They had sacrificed their families for a chance at victory. Now, they had to make that sacrifice worth something. And just as the despair threatened to swallow them completely, a sound came from the horizon, not the cry of a dying child, but the rumble of thunder. But the sky was clear. The vibration was in the earth. It was the sound of 250,000 feet marching in unison. The relief army had arrived. The time for starving was over. The time for dying in the mud had truly begun. The silence that had suffocated the valley for weeks was not broken by a single shout, but by a vibration that traveled through the soles of the feet, shaking the dust from the Roman helmets hanging on the palisades. It was a tremor in the bedrock. The sentries on the outer wall, the line of contravallation, squinted against the glare of the setting sun, their hands gripping their pila until their knuckles turned white. At first, it looked like a storm front moving in from the west, a dark, undulating mass that swallowed the horizon. But as it drew closer, the cloud resolved into details that chilled the blood of even the most veteran centurion. The mass bristled with the points of innumerable spears, glinting like sparks in a column of smoke. The standards of a dozen nations rose above the dust, the boars of the Aedui, the wheels of the Carnutes, the horses of the Sequani. It was not an army. It was a migration. The relief force had arrived, and it was a deluge of humanity that made the Roman legions look like a pebble standing against a tidal wave. Caesar had claimed in his writings that 250,000 warriors poured over the hills that day, a number so vast it defies comprehension. Historians still argue whether the relief army was truly 250,000 strong, as Caesar claimed, or if he exaggerated the numbers to magnify his own glory. But even the most conservative modern estimates place the number at nearly 100,000, outnumbering the Romans 2 to 1, perhaps 3 to 1. When you add the 80,000 starving warriors inside Alesia, the math becomes a terrifying equation. Caesar was now the meat in a grinder, surrounded by a sea of enemies that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Romans were trapped in their donut of fortifications, a thin ribbon of order in a world of chaotic violence. They looked out from their ramparts and saw the campfires of the relief army lighting up the hills like a mirror of the starry sky, a ring of fire that whispered a promise of annihilation. Leading this massive coalition was Commius, the Atrebatian, a figure of tragic irony who embodies the complex personal betrayals of this war. Years before, Caesar had made Commius a king, trusting him as a friend and ally, using him as an emissary to Britain. Now, Commius rode at the head of the army meant to destroy his creator, driven by a loyalty to his blood that outweighed his loyalty to his patron. His presence was a bitter reminder to Caesar that in Gaul, no friendship was deeper than the desire for freedom. As the relief army settled into their camps on the Musilafos plain, just a mile from the Roman outer works, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The Gauls did not attack immediately. They let their presence sink in. They let the Romans listen to the baritus, the low rhythmic chanting of thousands of warriors beating their weapons against their shields, a sound designed to unnerve the enemy, to rattle their bones before a single blow was struck. Inside Alesia, the arrival was met with a delirium of joy. The starving warriors, who had watched their wives and children die in the ditches, dragged themselves to the ramparts. They saw the fires on the hills. They heard the trumpets. The despair that had crushed them vanished, replaced by a sudden, ferocious hope. Vercingetorix, standing on the high rock of the Oppidum, must have felt a surge of vindication. His strategy had worked. He had pinned the wolf, and now the pack had come to finish the kill. He ordered his men to prepare. The moment the relief army attacked the outer wall, his forces would burst from the gates and attack the inner wall. They would crush the Romans between them, like grain between millstones. The first clash, when it came, was a probe, a test of the waters. The Gallic cavalry poured onto the plain, thousands of horsemen kicking up a storm of dust, challenging the Romans to come out and fight. Caesar, knowing that he could not show weakness, accepted the challenge. He sent his own cavalry out, along with the German mercenaries he had hired, huge bearded men from across the Rhine who fought with a savage intensity that terrified even the Gauls. The battle raged all afternoon in the space between the hills, a swirling melee of flashing swords and rearing horses. The legionaries manned the ramparts, cheering for their comrades, as if they were watching a gladiatorial game in the forum, while the Gauls on the heights of Alesia screamed for their deliverers. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. But as twilight fell, the discipline of the German cavalry turned the tide. They drove the Gallic horsemen back, pursuing them to the very edge of their camp. The Romans cheered, a roar of relief that echoed off the cliff faces. They had won the first round, but it was a hollow victory. The cavalry battle was merely the overture. The real threat, the tens of thousands of heavy infantry, the fanatic warriors who had sworn oaths to kill or die, had not yet moved. They were watching, learning, probing the Roman defenses for a weak point. The next day was quiet, a deceptive calm, as the Gauls manufactured ladders, grappling hooks, and fascions, bundles of wood to fill the Roman ditches. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. The Romans slept in their armor, their shields by their heads. They ate their meager rations standing up. They knew that the storm was not over. It was just taking a breath. Then, in the middle of the night, the world exploded. A shout went up from the Gallic lines, a roar so loud it reportedly woke the sleepers in Alesia, miles away. The relief army launched a massive night assault. Thousands of archers and slingers rained a hailstorm of missiles onto the Roman ramparts, forcing the legionaries to cower behind their shields. Under the cover of this barrage, the Gallic infantry surged forward, throwing their bundles of wood into the trenches, bridging the ditches, throwing ladders against the walls. Simultaneously, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix heard the signal. The gates of the town were thrown open, and the starving defenders poured out, rushing down the slope to attack the inner ring. The Romans were hit from both sides instantly. The darkness was filled with the screams of men, the splintering of wood, and the terrifying twang of the scorpions firing blindly into the night. This was the moment Caesar's architecture of cruelty proved its worth. The Gauls, charging in the dark, ran headlong into the traps. Men impaled themselves on the cipi, their screams alerting the Romans to their position. They fell into the lilies, the sharpened stakes piercing their feet and legs, leaving them writhing in the killing zone. The stimuli tore at their souls. The ground itself fought the Gauls, slowing their charge, breaking their momentum, turning a rush into a stumble. The Romans, fighting from their high towers, rained heavy stones and javelins down onto the confused mass. It was a chaotic, bloody, terrifying mess. The flare of torches illuminated brief vignettes of horror. A face twisted in pain, a ladder being pushed back, a centurion holding the line against 3 attackers. For hours, the battle raged in the dark. The noise was deafening. The clash of steel, the thud of bodies falling into ditches, the shouted orders in Latin and Gallic. But slowly, the Roman discipline held. The traps had done their grim work. The Gauls, unable to breach the walls and taking horrific casualties from the invisible defenses, began to fall back. As the sun rose, revealing a field littered with bodies and broken ladders, the relief army withdrew. Vercingetorix, seeing the attack fail, sounded the retreat and pulled his men back up the hill. The Romans had survived the night, but as they looked out at the enemy camp, they saw that the Gallic army was not leaving. They were regrouping. They had found a weak spot. To the north of the Roman line, there was a hill, Montrea, that was too large to be included in the fortifications. The Roman line had to run along its lower slope, leaving the high ground to the enemy. It was a fatal flaw in the geometry of the siege, a gap in the armor. The Gallic chieftains, gathered in their war council, had spotted it. They chose 60,000 of their best warriors, the super-heavy infantry, and placed them under the command of Vercassivellaunus, a cousin of Vercingetorix. Under the cover of the next night, They began a long, silent march around the back of the hills, moving into position behind Montrea. They were hiding in the blind spot, waiting for high noon. The hammer was being raised for one final crushing blow. The first two attacks had been tests. The next one would be the execution. The end of the world did not come at midnight, but at high noon, when the sun was standing directly overhead and the shadows were at their sharpest. It began on the slopes of Montrea, the one flaw in Caesar's geometry, the place where the Roman line was forced to dip below the crest of the hill. For hours, the 60,000 picked warriors under Vercassivellaunus had lain hidden in the tall grass and the ravines behind the ridge, silent and invisible, waiting for the sun to reach its zenith. When the signal finally came, it was not a horn, but a landslide of humanity. They crested the hill and poured down upon the Roman camp below like a river bursting a dam. The sheer weight of the charge was terrifying. These were the best of the Gallic nations, fresh and rested, screaming their war cries as they hurled themselves at the fortifications. At the exact same moment, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the movement. He knew this was the last roll of the dice. He did not hold back. He emptied the city. Every warrior who could stand, every man who could lift a spear, surged out of the gates, carrying fascines to fill the ditches and grappling hooks to tear down the palisades. The trap was finally working in reverse. The Romans were no longer the jailers. They were the prisoners, crushed between two walls of screaming iron. The fighting that erupted was unlike anything seen in the previous days. It was desperate, intimate, and suffocating. At the northern camp, the Roman position was critical. The Gauls were above them, raining javelins and stones down into the trenches, filling the ditches with earth and bodies faster than the Romans could clear them. The defensive advantages of the Lilia and the stimuli were nullified by the sheer volume of debris the Gauls threw over them. They were building a road of earth over the traps. The Roman commander there, Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, was fighting for his life, sending runner after runner to Caesar with the same desperate message. The line is bending. We cannot hold. Everywhere, the perimeter was aflame. Vercingetorix was attacking the southern fortifications, probing for weaknesses, tearing at the palisades with a frenzy born of starvation. The Romans were running from one crisis to another, patching holes in the line with their bodies, their reserves dwindling to nothing. The noise was a physical weight, a cacophony of metal on wood, the cracking of shields, and the screams of the dying that merged into a single continuous roar. Caesar, watching from a high vantage point, saw the disaster unfolding. He was the conductor of a symphony of violence, his eyes darting across the panoramic chaos. He saw the line at Montrea buckling. He sent 6 cohorts under Brutus to plug the gap. It wasn't enough. He sent 7 more under Gaius Fabius. It still wasn't enough. The Gauls were surging over the walls, tearing down the towers. Labienus was preparing to break out, to abandon the ramparts, and fight a last stand in the open, a move that would surely end in slaughter. The structure of the Roman army was fracturing. Panic, the invisible enemy that kills more armies than swords, was beginning to ripple through the ranks. Men were looking over their shoulders. The will to fight was evaporating in the heat and the dust. It was then that Caesar made the decision that would cement his legend. He did not send more orders. He sent himself. He grabbed a shield from a legionary, called for his personal guard, and did something theatrical, dangerous, and brilliantly calculated. He put on his paludamentum, the scarlet cloak of the commanding general. In the monochrome dust of the battlefield, that cloak was a beacon, a slash of blood-red color that could be seen by every soldier on the field. It was a target, yes, but it was also a flag. He rode directly into the thick of the fighting at the northern sector, shouting the names of his centurions, calling out to the men he knew, demanding to know if they were going to let their general die there in the mud. The effect was electric. The sight of the wolf himself, risking his life in the front rank, snapped the legionaries out of their panic. They abandoned their javelins and drew their gladi, throwing themselves at the Gauls with a renewed, manic ferocity. They were no longer fighting for Rome. They were fighting for the man in the red cloak. But courage alone could not stop 60,000 men. The Gauls were still pressing, still winning. The sheer physics of the battle were against the Romans. Vercassivellaunus was pushing them back step by bloody step. The Roman line was bowing, ready to snap. It was the moment where empires fall, where history holds its breath. And then, the miracle happened, or rather, the strategy paid its final dividend. Historians still argue whether the arrival of the German cavalry was a pre-planned masterstroke by Caesar, or a desperate improvisation that happened to work. But the timing suggests a genius for reading the flow of battle. Caesar had sent his German horsemen, the same ones who had won the skirmish days before, on a wide looping flank maneuver, riding hard around the back of the hills, completely unseen by the Gauls focused on the ramparts. Just as the Roman infantry was about to break under the pressure of Vercassivellaunus's assault, the Germans appeared on the crest of the hill, behind the Gallic army. They did not pause. They charged down the slope, crashing into the unprotected rear of the Gallic formation. The shock was total. The Gauls, who seconds before had victory in their teeth, suddenly found themselves the meat in the sandwich. The super-heavy infantry, packed tight and facing forward, could not turn to meet the new threat. Panic, which had been flirting with the Romans, now embraced the Gauls with a vengeance. The cry went up, "We are surrounded." The formation disintegrated. The warriors threw down their shields and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The German cavalry rode them down, hacking and slashing without mercy. The Roman infantry, seeing the enemy waver, surged forward with a final exhaustion-fueled roar. The slaughter was industrial. The 60,000 men of the relief force were not just defeated, they were erased. The slopes of Montrea turned slick with blood, the bodies piling up in the ditches they had tried to cross. Inside the lines, Vercingetorix saw it happen. He saw the standards of his cousin fall. He saw the relief army, the great hope of Gaul, crumple like a piece of parchment in a fire. He watched the German cavalry chasing the survivors into the woods, cutting them down like wheat. The noise of the battle changed from the roar of combat to the high-pitched wail of a rout. It was over. The hammer had shattered the handle, not the anvil. Vercingetorix stood on the ramparts of Alesia, the setting sun casting long shadows over the carnage, and felt the weight of the inevitable settle onto his shoulders. The relief army was gone. The traps were full of dead men, and the Romans, battered, bloody, but unbroken, were still there. The red cloak was still moving through the dust. He gave the order to retreat back into the city. The gates closed with a heavy, final boom that sounded like the closing of a tomb. The adrenaline faded. leaving only the hunger and the silence. The gambling was done. Now, there was only the paying of the debt. The sun that rose on the morning after the battle did not bring warmth. It brought a clarity that was colder than the night. Inside the walls of Alesia, the silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the survivors. The shouting was gone. The frantic energy of the assault had evaporated, leaving behind only the dull ache of wounds and the hollow, gnawing reality of the famine. The warriors looked out over the ramparts, their eyes scanning the horizon for the standards of the relief army, for the dust of returning cavalry, for any sign that the nightmare was not over. But there was nothing. The hills were empty. The birds were returning to the trees, where the great Gallic camp had stood only hours before, pecking at the ground where 250,000 men had slept. The relief army had dissolved like mist in a strong wind, scattered to the four winds by the terror of the German horsemen, leaving Alesia alone on its rock, an island in a sea of Roman iron. The gamble had failed. The sacrifice of the women and children in the ditches had been for nothing. The realization hit the defenders not with a scream, but with a quiet, crushing weight. Gaul had died in the night. Vercingetorix understood this better than anyone. He was a realist, a man who had played the game of nations with a brilliance that had terrified Rome. But he knew when the board had been overturned. He did not try to rally his men for a final suicidal charge. He knew they were too weak, too broken by hunger and despair. Instead, he called a council of the remaining chieftains. The atmosphere in the meeting hall was funereal. These were the proud nobles of the Arvani, the Ahidwi, the Sequani, men who had sworn to drive the Romans into the sea, now reduced to skeletons in ragged tunics. Vercingetorix stood before them, and according to the accounts that have survived, he spoke with a dignity that transcended the squalor of their defeat. He told them that he had not undertaken this war for his own private gain, but for the common liberty of all Gaul. He acknowledged that the war was lost, and that they must now yield to fortune. He offered them a choice, a final act of leadership. They could kill him to appease the Romans, or they could hand him over alive as a peace offering. He was the cause of a Caesar's wrath. Perhaps his surrender would buy mercy for the rest. The chieftains sent envoys to Caesar to ask his terms. The answer was short, brutal, and non-negotiable. Surrender your weapons. Surrender your leaders. The game was over. The Romans did not negotiate with defeated rebels. They dictated to them. Vercingetorix accepted his fate. He returned to his quarters to prepare for the final act of his command. And here, the narrative shifts from the gritty reality of starvation to a moment of theatricality so potent that it has echoed through art and literature for 2,000 years. Historians still argue whether the dramatic surrender of Vercingetorix happened exactly as the later Greek historians described it, with its ritualistic flair, or if it was a simpler, grimmer affair, as Caesar's own terse writings suggest. Caesar merely wrote, "Vercingetorix is surrendered, weapons are laid down." But the legend tells us of something more, something that feels true to the Celtic spirit of the man, a final, defiant assertion of nobility in the face of humiliation. Imagine the scene through the lens of that legend. The gates of Alesia groaned open one last time. From the shadows of the archway, a lone rider emerged. It was Vercingetorix. He had not dressed in the rags of a beggar. He had donned his finest armor. His helmet was polished, his cloak was a vibrant plaid, and his horse was groomed to a shine, caparisoned in silver and leather. He did not walk with his head down. He rode. He rode down the causeway, across the no man's land, where the bones of the civilians still lay, moving through the zone of the traps that had broken his people. The Roman legions were drawn up in lines, silent, watching this solitary figure approach. Caesar was seated on a tribunal, a raised platform in front of the camp, wearing the purple-bordered toga of a magistrate, the master of the world, waiting for his due. Vercingetorix did not stop immediately. He rode around the tribunal in a circle, a sacred Celtic movement, perhaps a ritual to bind the victor or a solar symbol of completion. He said nothing. The silence was unnerving, the rhythmic hoofbeats on the hard earth, the only sound in the valley. Then he stopped his horse in front of Caesar. He dismounted. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to strip away the symbols of his power. He unbuckled his sword belt and let the heavy scabbard fall to the dust. He removed his helmet, revealing the long hair of a Gallic free man. He took off his armor, piece by piece, until he stood vulnerable before his conqueror. Then he sank to his knees and remained silent. It was a gesture of total submission, but also of profound accusation. He was offering up not just himself, but the soul of independent Gaul, placing it at the feet of the man who had destroyed it. Caesar looked down at the man who had haunted his nightmares for a year, the man who had almost ruined him. There was no handshake, no moment of soldierly respect between equals. Caesar was not a romantic. He was a Roman politician who had just survived a near-death experience. He saw Vercingetorix not as a noble rival, but as a traitor who had broken his treaties and incited a rebellion that cost thousands of Roman lives. He looked at the king of the Arverni with cold, hard eyes and signaled to his guards. The chains were brought out. The hands that had united the tribes were bound in iron. Vercingetorix was dragged away, not to a frantic execution, but to the slow, dark misery of captivity. The wolf had finally caught his prey, but he would not kill him yet. He needed him. A dead king is a martyr. A chained king is a trophy. With the king gone, the surrender of the army proceeded with ruthless efficiency. The gates of Alesia were thrown wide, and the defenders marched out, dropping their spears and shields into a growing pile that became a mountain of scrap metal. They were 80,000 strong, or what was left of them. But they were no longer an army. They were currency. Caesar needed to reward his legionaries for their loyalty and their labor, and he did so with human flesh. The entire Gallic garrison was divided up as booty. Every single Roman soldier received one Gallic prisoner as a personal slave to sell or keep. The men who had fought for the liberty of Gaul were reduced to property, destined to work in the fields of Italy or die in the mines of Spain. It was the total commodification of a people. The Aedui and Arverni tribes were treated slightly better. Caesar hoped to use them to keep the peace later. But for the rest, the war ended in the shackles of servitude. The sun set that evening over a transformed world. The fires of the Roman camp burned bright, fueled by the timber of the Gallic defenses. The songs of the legionaries were loud and raucous, the release of tension after months of fear. But in the tent where Vercingetorix sat in darkness, and in the long lines of chained men waiting for the slave markets, there was only the sound of breathing, the noise of the free Celtic world, the clang of the smithy, the song of the bard, the debate of the council had been silenced. The mosaic had been smashed, The map had been redrawn. The hill of Alesia, once a proud capital, was now just a tombstone. The war was over. Caesar had won. But as the night deepened, a different kind of darkness began to close in around the victor and the vanquished alike. For the end of the war was only the beginning of the long, slow walk toward the final tragedy of the triumph. The war ended with the closing of a shackle, but the dying took 6 long years. For Vercingetorix, the surrender at Alesia was not the conclusion of his suffering, but the beginning of a slow, suffocating purgatory. He was not granted the mercy of a soldier's death on the battlefield, nor the swift execution of a dangerous rebel. Instead, he was packed away like a weapon that might be needed later, transported across the Alps to the city of Rome, and lowered into the earth. His destination was the Tullianum, also known as the Marmatine prison, a place that ancient writers described with a shudder. It was not a prison in the modern sense, with bars and guards. It was a hole in the ground, a damp, subterranean dungeon carved into the rock at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. It was a place of repulsive filth, darkness, and stench, where the enemies of Rome were kept to wait for the state to remember them. For 6 years, the king of the Averni existed in this stone tomb. Imagine the psychological torture of a man born to the open skies of the massive Central, a man who had led armies across vast plains and stood on the ramparts of high fortresses, now confined to a cell where he could not even tell the passing of the seasons. He sat in the dark while the world above him burned with a new fire. Caesar, having conquered Gaul, did not immediately return to Rome to celebrate. The political situation had collapsed. The Senate turned against him, demanding he lay down his command. Caesar refused, crossed the Rubicon, and plunged the Roman world into a civil war that would tear the Republic apart. While Caesar fought Pompey in Greece, while he maneuvered in Egypt with Cleopatra, while he cemented his dictatorship, Vercingetorix waited. He was a ghost in the machine, a living artifact of a war that everyone else had moved on from. He was kept alive for one reason only: the triumph. Caesar needed him. A triumph was not complete without the enemy leader. The physical proof of the victory to parade before the mob. And so, the king was force-fed, kept healthy enough to walk, but broken enough not to fight. Finally, in 46 BCE, the day arrived. The iron grate above his cell was lifted, and the light of the sun, harsh and blinding, after years of gloom, flooded in. Hands reached down to haul him up. He was washed, perhaps dressed again, in the mockery of his royal finery, and dragged into the chaotic noise of the Roman streets. It was the day of Caesar's quadruple triumph. One day for Gaul, one for Egypt, one for Pontus, one for Africa. The city was a riot of color and sound. Flowers were scattered on the streets. Incense burned in clouds that stung the eyes, and the roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wall of sound screaming the name of the dictator. Vercingetorix was the centerpiece of the Gallic procession. He walked in chains, likely behind a float displaying captured Gallic weapons or paintings of the siege of Alesia. He was paraded past the temples of gods he did not know, through the forum where the destiny of his people had been decided by men in togas. The crowd jeered at him, spitting on the man who had almost broken the legions. Historians still argue whether he maintained his composure during this final walk, staring ahead with the stoicism of a chieftain, or if he was a broken shell of a man stumbling in the glare. but the destination was the same. The procession wound its way up toward the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the symbolic heart of Roman power. But the enemy leader was not permitted to ascend to the temple. That was for the victor. At a certain point in the route, the procession paused. Vercingetorix was pulled out of the line. He was led aside, perhaps back toward the grim entrance of the Tullianum, or to a nearby execution site called the Gemonian Stairs. The noise of the triumph continued, the cheers for Caesar ringing in his ears, but for Vercingetorix, the sound began to fade. The executioner was waiting. There was no speech, no final trial. It was a bureaucratic act, a checklist item to be crossed off. A cord was looped around his neck. The king of the Gauls, the victor of 100 battles, the man who had united a civilization, was strangled. His body was likely thrown onto the stairs for the crowds to abuse, then dragged with a hook and tossed into the Tiber River to wash away into the sea. He vanished, unburied, returning to the water and the earth, but not the earth of his home. With his death, the silence that had begun at Alesia became permanent. The Gaul he had fought for ceased to exist. In the decades that followed, the Romanization of the province was rapid and total. The hilltops where the Oppida stood were abandoned or converted into Roman towns with forums and baths. The Druids were suppressed, their sacred groves felled, their oral history lost to the wind. The children of the warriors who had died in the trenches of Alesia grew up speaking Latin, wearing togas, and fighting in the Roman legions. They became Gallo-Romans, a hybrid people who built a new civilization on the ashes of the old. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, settled over the land, a peace bought with the silence of the sword. The wild, fractured, beautiful mosaic was paved over with a smooth, uniform road. Today, if you go to Alesia, you will find a statue of Vercingetorix, erected in the 19th century by Napoleon III. It stands on the edge of the plateau, looking out over the valley where the traps were laid and the women died. But the statue bears the face of Napoleon, not the Gaul, a final layer of myth placed over the history. The real man is gone, dissolved into the soil, yet the wind still blows through the grass on Mont Auxois. And if you listen closely in the twilight, when the tourists have gone and the modern world recedes, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of a hammer on bronze, the neigh of a horse, and the whisper of a name that Rome tried to erase but could only break. And now the dust settles. The legions have marched away, their iron footsteps fading into the distance of time. The shouting of the crowds in Rome has turned to a murmur, and the fires of the siege have burned down to cold, grey ash. We are back in the quiet safety of the present, far from the hunger and the mud. The story of Caesar and Vercingetorix is finished, folded away into the pages of history, where it can no longer hurt anyone. Take a deep breath. Let the air fill your lungs, cool and clean, washing away the smoke of the ancient battlefields. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the bed, heavy and relaxed. The tension of the siege is released. There are no walls around you, no traps in the dark, only the soft embrace of the night. The hill of Alesia is peaceful now. Wildflowers grow where the trenches were dug. The rivers flow gently, no longer red, but clear and reflecting the moon. History is a river that flows on, carrying the grief and the glory away, leaving us here on the shore, safe and warm. You have walked through the storm and come out the other side. Now it is time to rest. Let the darkness wrap around you like a soft cloak. not of red, but of velvet blue. The world is quiet, the past is sleeping, and you can sleep too. Sweet dreams.